Today's reading is from Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 45. A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. "See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. Now, to begin, I want to summarize the passage down to two main things, to say where we're going with it. Firstly, a picture of the work of Jesus in not only physically restoring the sick, but also allowing us to be part of God's community, his people. Secondly, a lesson that sin carries consequences, not just for us, but for others around us. Sin isn't always an act of direct malevolence, deliberately destructive, but is so often simply falling short of what is actively good and actively right, a failure to do the positive good. Among other things, sin is described in the Bible as lawlessness, pointing at hearts that desire to please themselves, but also as failing to fully follow what we've been called by God to be and do. Now, as always, when we approach a passage, we ask ourselves, what is our context? What has the author included to shape our understanding of the bigger picture, the direction that we're going in? Mark's style means that he's crammed in a lot already in the first 39 verses. We meet the forerunner of Jesus, John the Baptist. Jesus called some of his followers his disciples. And then we have the most relevant part of the context, Jesus driving out demons and healing many people, and the news of this spreading around the region of Galilee, where he's been preaching, as we've seen already. Now, this healing is the most relevant part because it allows us to understand the beginning of today's passage, how it happens. Because normally with leprosy, the sufferers would be permanent outcasts, living in isolated areas, away from anyone they could infect. Without going into too much detail, leprosy or Hansen disease is something that would typically end up disfiguring the sufferer, not only through the progress of the disease itself, but through the damage that the infected would often do to themselves through their reduced ability to feel sensations. They would understandably be shunned by others and would be required to make themselves known if they were on the move, ringing handbells or wearing rags to be instantly obvious from a distance, that kind of thing, so that people could easily avoid them, or as likely as not, in some cases, drive them away. So to begin the passage today with, "A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees," is already very much out of the ordinary. The news of Jesus, of what Jesus has been doing, has reached here. A man who can do the miraculous, a man who heals the sick in an instant with a touch or a word. Pulling our view outwards again, we have to recognize that the miracles weren't an end in themselves, but they were there to point to Jesus' larger purpose, which he's already addressed just back in verse 38. The preaching was the point, the message of the kingdom, looking at the reconciliation of people to God, and the miracles, the healings, the deliverances, the things that this man has heard about, with the signs that validated his message and showed his compassion for people living in a world corrupted by the effects of sin. Jesus didn't go around with lightning flashing from his fingertips, pulling rabbits, quails and bread from the folds of his cloak. When we look at the Gospel of John, for example, John mentions there were innumerable more miracles done by Jesus that weren't recorded. Why does nobody mention them? In all likelihood, they were done in private, in secluded rooms, deserted areas, small villages whose names are lost to time, instances that were known by John because he was with Jesus as one of his disciples, but not known by the world because the miracles weren't there to raise an army of shallow followers eager for the next wondrous miracle. And in fact, in several instances across the Gospels, we see that there are difficulties, issues, or misunderstandings that come about because of the miracles. The man born blind who was healed in John 9 ends up insulted and thrown out by his community leaders directly because of the healing. And the feeding miracle in John 6 leads to people not wanting what the miracle pointed to, but their bellies filled again. And what about where Jesus is accused of driving out demons by the power of Satan? His acts led to misunderstanding. And in today's passage, we'll see the problems caused by the leper not following instructions after his miracle. Reconciliation between God and men was the end. That was the aim. Jesus touched the man. And rather than Jesus being defiled, ritually unclean, or even infected by the disease, instead we get that rich image regarding this diseased man. He was cleansed. The passage never talks about healing, just about the man being made clean. Everything that this man suffered meant that he was on the outside. He was defiled, he was unclean religiously and physically. He was incapable of going to the temple, of being part of the sacrifices and celebrations that were at the heart of the religion of the Jewish people. Up until this point, he was barred from being part of the Passover or the Day of Atonement. Jesus didn't just remove the disease, he allowed him to be part of the community again, to engage in religious worship and sacrifice as part of the larger Jewish people. And we can see here in this passage that Jesus' desire was that the man show the religious leaders of his day Jesus was in fact following the law and teaching others to do the same. Obedience to Yahweh, to what the God of the Mosaic covenant had said, was fundamentally necessary. His message to the man was, there's no longer any reason for you to be on the outside. Now go and do what you are supposed to do in order to prove this according to the law of Moses. Showing himself to the priests, making the necessary sacrifices, having the priests perform the necessary acts as taught in Leviticus 14. All of this would allow the man to be part of the community again in the right way. To do anything else would have been bypassing the law of God, to act with presumption. To take upon himself the right to integrate back into society regardless of the laws put in place to protect that society. Jesus cleansed the leper, allowing him to be able to approach God again in the way that any other Jewish person of the day could. And that's the point, isn't it? We see in the account of this former leper a picture of the gospel. The good news about the larger work and message of Jesus. The good news that Jesus himself does actually follow the law of God and fulfills it on our behalf. When Jesus cleansed this man, he made him whole again. Everything restored to the way it should have been. That's part of the gospel. that we ourselves are restored to the way that we should have been. But regarding this man, how can we know this? How can we know that he was restored to the way that he should have been, at least physically? The man went throughout the town, spreading the news freely. If there was any visible sign of disfigurement, even if no obvious sign of fresh corruption, he would have been isolated for a period of time according to the quarantine rules that were in place in the Mosaic law, and then observed afterwards to make sure he was free of disease and was no threat to the community. Now, why is this relevant? Because Mark deliberately adds this: that Jesus was forced to stay out in the lonely places, the desolate places. He is confronted with a leper, a man who is forced out of his community, his family, who has to live separately to everyone who isn't afflicted with leprosy, and Jesus cleanses him. He restores this man not just from the disease, but from the effects of the disease, including isolation. Directly because of this, Jesus himself becomes isolated from the community. This obviously isn't strictly literal, in the sense that Jesus could still technically be around other people. He wasn't in quarantine. But Mark deliberately and knowingly presents this image of reversal. This gospel doesn't pad accounts out, so the inclusion of the detail is meaningful. Keep in mind, Mark is writing this down much later, likely as Peter's scribe, or something of that nature. So he already knows what lays ahead. He knows that Jesus will take the consequence of sin upon himself, become sin for all who trust in him, take our place, so that we can have his right standing, his righteousness upon ourselves, making us clean. Early in this gospel account, Mark is laying out this imagery of cleansing and adding to it that Jesus takes the place of the one he cleanses. We get to stand rightly before God because Jesus took upon himself the consequences of our shame, our rebellion, our desire to live by our own rules and standards. He took our shame and guilt, the things that separated us from God, upon himself, and in turn restored us, so that, legally speaking, we appear to God as though we were never corrupted in the first place, which physically is how this leper appeared, as though he'd never been corrupted in the first place. And for us, all of that is freely given by grace through faith. Not because of our efforts and works, because we have no place to boast of ever having earned any of our right legal standing before God. And as with us, so it was with this man. The cleansing comes first, and then the call to act upon that cleansing in obedience to God. Mark wants to emphasize the man's disobedience. He speaks of Jesus' strong warning. He lays out what the clear instruction was. He inserts the contrary behavior, the but or the instead. And then we are shown the results of that disobedience. Mark lays it on thick that this man was wrong. Driven by his understandable excitement, his overwhelming joy, the man doesn't want to take a long journey to Jerusalem to do what is needed, but instead acts on his own passions and desires. And looking at the results, following what Jesus said would have been better than acting according to how he felt. How Jesus ministered to people was directly impacted by the results of what this man chose to do instead. How many sick people weren't healed because of this man, or at least were delayed in receiving their sickness, in their healing, because they had to be brought out to where Jesus was? How many other blessings were lost or delayed because he did not do what he was supposed to do, what he was told directly to do? And would we be, or are we, any different? Driven by our feelings, we can end up thinking we are doing right, when in fact we are doing wrong, acting against the interests of the gospel. The challenge is always to weigh up what we think and feel, how our hearts tell us to act, against the clarity of what God has said. Whatever our desire, our big plan, our grand idea, however noble, useful, or loving the thing we think what we want is, submission to God has to come before and above it. This is a threat to us as individuals and as a larger body, as a church. And as in today's passage, the fruit from that sin so rarely impacts only us. I think back to the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, and the passage sometimes used to teach so-called generational curses. Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, referring to idols. It says, "You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me." The third and fourth generations were those who might reasonably be alive during the time when a man gave himself over to wrong worship, trusting in false gods. God is pointing out that his family around him are likely to suffer as a result of his sin, which makes sense when you consider that the patriarch of a family is likely to influence the behavior of his children and their children. If a father or grandfather of the time was killed or became sick as a result of his sin, the financial impact of that would be felt by those immediately around him, certainly down the generations, with losses that could potentially still be felt for years afterwards, down further generations to the third or fourth generation. I've seen a marriage ruined. People walk away from the church because someone outside of that marriage did something that seemed good, seemed to be helpful, seemed to be motivated by the right desires, but something that fell short of the wisdom that God had given through his word. We live at a time when whole denominations, and certainly individual churches, are in danger of being split because of what seems right, what seems loving, what seems kind. We're in danger of following the Joel Osteen approach to the faith, where sin is never called out because it's just important to build people up. But I don't see why it has to be one thing or the other. Part of how the Bible teaches us to love one another is by warning against sin, because it is destructive. Destructive to true faith, destructive to true peace with God, destructive to the work of spreading the message of the gospel which we see today, destructive to our health, destructive to our relationships and to the people around us. This man's sin, this man falling short of what Jesus and the Mosaic law called him to do, had consequences for other people. Why do I think that Mark wants us to grasp this? Because over half of the account is given over to the instructions from Jesus, the man ignoring them, and the consequence of him falling short of what both Jesus and the law of Moses told him. Jesus took our place, he bore our sin and the consequence of our sin. Our shame was on him. And because of that, because we are made clean through him and his work, the call on our lives is to seek not what seems right to us, not what is in line solely with our own joy and desires, but that which God has said. We have been cleansed just as much as this leper was, but we are called not to respond how he did, but rather to submit to God and what he has said. For further reflection on this, I think it's worth reading through Romans chapter 5 and chapter 6. Amen.